In the latest, Burkina Faso's armed forces have received a fresh consignment of Chinese-manufactured armored vehicles and artillery pieces. This, as the junta-led nation pushes to strengthen its military against terrorism.
China is one of Africa's most important trading and investment partners. However, Beijing is now also extending this relationship into the defense industry. In the Sahel, where Chinese artillery and armaments have been advancing, this pattern is now readily apparent. Recently, a new shipment of armored vehicles and artillery pieces made in China was sent to Burkina Faso's military forces. Heavy artillery, armored vehicles, rocket launchers, and other cutting-edge Chinese armaments were recently shipped to Burkina Faso and are already positioned on its territory. The Sahelian battlefield may never be the same after a country that was once dependent on France and the United States shifted east. What does this signify for the future of Africa and the war in Burkina Faso, however, and why did it occur at this time? Let's investigate that. In August 2025, the noise of motors, the grind of metal, and the unexpected presence of something rarely seen in West Africa shattered the calm streets of Ouagadougou. Under strict security, brand new Chinese rocket launchers, artillery, and armored vehicles are rolling into military installations. It wasn't propaganda, rumors, or conjecture. Infinite lines of VN-22B fire support vehicles, PLL-05 self-propelled gun mortars, and SR-5 multiple rocket launchers, all camouflaged in desert and vegetation, were swiftly visible in video footage that defense specialists confirmed. As engineers got the machines ready for use, soldiers proudly stood next to them. This was more than just a delivery for Burkina Faso. It served as outward evidence of a shift away from the West and toward a new military era. The VN-22B, a six-wheeled armored platform that can withstand direct strikes from armor-piercing rounds, while firing its stabilized 30mm autocannon at swift targets, was the shipment's focal point. Its sophisticated fire control technology instantaneously changes how Burkina Faso forces may react to ambushes on rugged terrain by enabling soldiers to lock on precisely even while moving. For a nation that, until recently, mainly relied on pickup trucks and used carriers for frontline activities, seeing these machines drive by must have been an unreal experience. However, the delivery involved more than just armored fire support. The PLL-05 120mm gun mortars, hybrid systems placed on armored chassis that can function as both mortars and cannons, were positioned next to the VN-22Bs. In actuality, this enables commanders to cover insurgent positions from afar and then quickly switch to direct fire in the event that militants approach. The PLL-05 offers a degree of combat versatility that soldiers who have been used to either antiquated mortars or exposed artillery personnel have never experienced. The SR-5 multiple rocket launch systems, which each had modular pods that could launch guided and unguided munitions up to 70 kilometers, were arguably the most striking of them. For the first time, Burkina Faso has a viable long-range attack option thanks to these systems. The possibility of precision-guided rockets raining down from a distance has become a threat to militants who previously sought refuge in distant sites. Knowing that rebel sanctuaries are no longer impregnable could have a psychological impact that is just as great as the actual firepower. This gesture was not unique to this delivery. The logistical backbone required to sustain contemporary combat operations has already been built by previous shipments over the past year, which comprised Norinco CSVP-14 mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, CSVN-9 armored personnel carriers, and Shockman heavy logistics trucks. The August 2025 package, however, is notable for its scope, elegance, and prominence. This delivery, in contrast to previous ones that arrived with little fanfare, was made public and even triumphantly. indicating to both local and international audiences that Burkina Faso is no longer struggling with scraps. It is being rearmed with cutting-edge equipment. The timing is just as important, as military assistance from the West has decreased. Ouagadougou has become more and more isolated. The United States has reduced its presence. France has pulled out, and foreign pledges of assistance have time and again fallen short of materializing into weapons on the ground. China moved into that void with steel convoys rather than words. This was a bold delivery. Beijing advances where the West retreats. However, one cannot ignore the dangers. The effectiveness of modern systems depends on how well trained the troops are to use them. It takes new doctrines, intensive training, and logistical discipline to integrate autocannons, hybrid mortars, and modular rocket systems. If handled improperly, these resources can stop being useful game changers and instead become into symbolic awards. However, based on the volume and speed of Chinese delivery, Beijing appears determined to ensure that the systems don't sit idle by including training and support in addition to weaponry. The delivery of this weapons marks a significant turning point for Burkina Faso. Once dismissed as overworked and ill-prepared, the army now has capabilities that are on par with or better than those of many of its neighbors. Armored columns armed with long-range rockets and rapid-fire autocannons may soon confront insurgents, used to storming convoys that are susceptible. But the real question is whether firepower alone can change the course of the war. We must thus inquire as to why Burkina Faso saw the need for such a change. Furthermore, how do these weapons take into account the reality of the ground war? One must enter the difficult realities that Burkina Faso has endured over the past 10 years in order to comprehend why the August 2025 weapons transfer was so important. Large portions of the nation have been transformed into war zones by insurgencies since 2015. Entire families were forced to flee their homes, government outposts were overwhelmed, and villages in the north and east were set on fire. With almost 2 million refugees by 2024, Burkina Faso is one of the focal points of Africa's humanitarian disaster. The army was frequently unable to react because it was overworked and ill-prepared, arriving on motorbikes or pickups. Militants quickly attacked communities and convoys before disappearing into the woods before security personnel could respond. Old Kalashnikovs, a few aging armored carriers, and a few pieces of artillery were no match for the militants, who were always changing their tactics. The insurgents changed the battlefield whenever the state appeared to retake territory, putting soldiers in a loop of reaction rather than initiative. For this reason, the new systems that were provided in August were viewed as lifelines rather than just tools. Every weapon specifically addressed a flaw that had plagued the army for many years. Soldiers were able to react to ambushes in real time, thanks to the VN-22B fire support vehicles. These armored platforms let troops to advance undercover while retaliating with heavy autocannon fire that is accurate enough to hit moving targets at high speed, unlike convoys, which are easy prey on open roadways. This type of mobility and survival can be the difference between tragedy and dominance in a fight, when the majority of attacks take place during transit. Another issue that the PLL-05 gun mortars addressed was flexibility. Insurgents in rural areas conceal themselves in mud structures or forest patches, making it challenging to dislodge them using small weapons fire. Such positions could be shelled by conventional mortars, but workers were exposed and lacked the agility to adjust as militants closed in. If the combat moves into close quarters, commanders can use the PLL-05 to shell enemy hideouts from a safe distance, and then engage directly without changing platforms. Burkina Faso units may now set the pace for the first time, rather than having to continually adapt. Then, perhaps most importantly, there are the SR-5 rocket systems. The size of Burkina Faso's rural landscape has long been used by insurgents to their advantage. fleeing far into uncontrolled areas where the army could not reach them. Those sanctuaries are no longer impenetrable since missiles can now strike targets up to 70 kilometers away. The army can undertake precise strikes on recognized camps, training grounds, or supply depots, especially with guided weapons. This alters the psychological as well as the military calculus. Because insurgent organizations operate outside of patrol routes, they can no longer presume that they are safe. Morale was also a factor in the necessity of adopting such technologies. Soldiers from Burkina Faso battled for years, feeling as though they were being sent into unwinnable fights with subpar equipment. Cohesion and occasionally discipline were undermined by the sense of futility. The introduction of cutting-edge weapons does more than just boost firepower. It gives you back your confidence. The rank-and-file soldier is informed that his government is making an investment in his survival and chances of winning. That psychological change could be crucial in wars like these, when rebels rely as much on demoralization as they do on weaponry. However, even though weapons address the current tactical issues, they also bring up new issues. Why did China step in to give them instead of the more conventional Western partners? The US invested billions in counterinsurgency efforts throughout Africa, whereas France used to dominate the Sahelian security infrastructure. How, therefore, did Ouagadougou come to be saved by turning east? Paris wrote Burkina Faso's security narrative for decades. Once viewed as a faithful outpost of France's military presence in the Sahel, the nation relied on French firepower, trainers, and advisors to combat rebel threats. But there was a price for that reliance. Paris frequently set the conditions, requiring political allegiance, economic compromises, and acceptance of France's dominant role in the area in order to provide aid and a military presence. Resentment bubbled out when insurgencies grew, and French forces were unable to provide long-term stability. By 2022, the streets of Ouagadougou were crowded with demonstrations demanding an end to French rule. The security guarantees that had previously served as the cornerstone of Burkina Faso's defense posture were eventually removed along with the French troops. Although it may have been anticipated that the United States would step in, Washington took a more measured approach. Although it provided intelligence and sporadic assistance, its involvement in the Sahel was primarily motivated by counterinsurgency objectives, rather than the local state's existential concerns. Leaders in Burkina Faso expressed dissatisfaction at the stringent requirements, focus on governance reforms, oversight procedures, and limitations on the use of U.S. funding. Such delays and warnings felt like a luxury that a government that was constantly under siege from insurgents could not afford. China appeared as a substitute at this point. Beijing does not bind its arms transactions with political conditions like the West does. It does not link deliveries to election schedules or call for revisions. Rather, it provides financial flexibility, speed, and volume. That strategy was much more appealing to Captain Ibrahim Traore's administration, which has based its policies on independence and sovereignty, whereas the West talked about responsibility and democracy. China just sent weapons. But symbolism was more important than convenience. Ouagadougou made a conscious move by turning to Beijing. Burkina Faso no longer wanted to be a Western client state. By choosing partners based on interests rather than colonial ties, it was reaffirming its right. The simple fact that the Chinese convoys are visible adds to this symbolic dimension. In contrast to Western weapons, which are frequently delivered covertly and in tiny amounts, the August 2025 shipment was publicly displayed, captured on camera, and disseminated throughout the area. It was intended to be viewed as a flag anchored in the shifting geopolitical sands of the Sahel, not merely as a weapons transfer. A larger geographical tendency is also reflected in the time. Due to comparable insurgencies, Mali and Niger have also turned away from France. Mali has publicly embraced Russian military contractors, while Niger is looking into Turkish and Chinese alternatives. Today, the three countries make together a bloc that is becoming more and more post-Western. Beijing uses armaments as the currency of influence and places itself at the center of this realignment by providing Burkina Faso with contemporary systems. The agreement extends well beyond Burkina Faso to China. It is a component of a long-term plan to strengthen relations with Africa through infrastructure, trade, and security. Sales of weapons provide access to maintenance contracts, training initiatives, and enduring military alliances. They essentially tie African troops to Chinese supply lines, guaranteeing reliance on Beijing rather than Paris or Washington. Each delivery of an armored vehicle and rocket launcher also creates a relationship that moves the balance of power away from the West. Therefore, Burkina Faso's choice has much to do with more than just combat survival. It was about defending its sovereignty and forming alliances with allies who honor its decisions rather than impose them. However, this poses an additional useful query. How does a nation with one of the lowest per capita GDPs in the world afford to maintain such advanced systems? The deal's innovative financial and political arrangements, a tale that illustrates the extent to which both parties are prepared to go in order to protect their interests, hold the key to the solution, not ideology. Add your voice to the total liberation of Africa by leaving a comment in the comments section below. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more informative videos like this one. Let's proceed. The economy of Burkina Faso is insecure. Convoys of recently purchased Chinese armored vehicles moving into military sites raises serious concerns, given that the country has one of the lowest GDPs per capita in the world, severe unemployment, and large segments of its population displaced by violence. How can a nation in such dire financial straits afford such a weaponry? The structure of China's transactions holds the key to the solution. Beijing has mastered the art of flexible defense finance, in contrast to Western suppliers who frequently demand cash up front and enforce stringent repayment schedules. This probably consists of a mix of concessional loans, deferred payments, and possibly barter-style agreements based on future natural resource profits for Burkina Faso. With this paradigm, a state under duress can acquire weapons now while deferring the cost until later. The most probable foundation for these arrangements is gold. One of Africa's leading producers of gold, Burkina Faso already relies heavily on its gold earnings for foreign exchange. According to analysts, Ouagadougou might have promised collateral for the arms transaction in the form of a portion of future gold exports. The government guarantees that it can obtain instant firepower without depleting its coffers by linking repayment to resources rather than cash transfers. This model is not brand new. In countries like Angola and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where infrastructure and armament projects were backed by oil and mineral money, China has employed comparable procedures. Another option is what economists refer to as concessional weapons loans, which have limited penalties, low interest rates, and payback plans spread out over decades. This is not charity for Beijing. It's a calculated investment. China guarantees Burkina Faso becomes a long-term partner by facilitating short-term payback, tying Burkina Faso to Chinese supply chains for maintenance, training, and replacement parts. Once an army is using Chinese systems, it becomes impractical and expensive to swap suppliers. Burkina Faso, however, is not investing all of its resources in Beijing. Additionally, Traore's administration has sought agreements with Egypt for armored vehicles, Turkey for drones, and investments in domestic manufacturing of light armored vehicles. This diversification is intentional. In addition to preventing dependency, it increases Ouagadougou's negotiating leverage. Burkina Faso can bargain for better financial terms with each partner by demonstrating its possibilities. Therefore, the Chinese agreement is a component of a larger supplier competition strategy rather than a standalone transaction. Critics contend that by tying Burkina Faso into lengthy repayment plans that would limit its sovereignty, such agreements run the risk of mortgaging the nation's future. Supporters, however, argue that survival today is more important than hypothetical worries tomorrow. The immediate cost of inaction is significantly higher than the postponed cost of loans, especially when towns are being destroyed, soldiers are being demoralized, and borders are being threatened. The decision is clear-cut for Burkina Faso's government. Arm yourself now or risk the state's collapse. A domestic political perspective is also present. Traore's government strengthens its credibility by obtaining cutting-edge weapons through flexible finance. The leadership portrays itself as capable of overcoming Western desertion. Soldiers are given improved equipment, and citizens witness obvious evidence of rearmament. In this way, politics and economics play equal roles in the agreement. The Burkina Faso government cannot afford to appear weak, and Chinese funding makes sure that it doesn't have to do so both domestically and internationally. However, this financial ingenuity helps us see the wider picture. Burkina Faso is not only purchasing weapons if China is able to supply advanced weapons on loan, backed by resources, and delivered quickly. It is adopting a new international relations framework, a system in which the terms of interaction are established by Beijing rather than by Paris or Washington. Thus, the last query arises: what does this change portend for the Sahel's and Africa's overall future? Will these agreements only establish new dependence under a different patron, or will they stabilize the area? That is the argument that will shape this story's next chapter. The introduction of Chinese weaponry into Burkina Faso has an impact on the entire Sahel, not just one nation's military. Foreign operations, especially France's Operation Barkhane and the larger Western-led security architecture, have shaped this region for many years. That landscape is currently being destroyed and replaced by a brand new, erratic, and noticeably multipolar one. The most obvious indication yet that the Sahel is not satisfied with remaining a Western sphere of influence is Burkina Faso's agreement with China. The balance of power in the region will be most immediately affected. While neighboring Mali has relied largely on Russian Wagner contractors, Niger has been looking into Turkish drones and Chinese collaborations following its political unrest. A new bloc is emerging as Burkina Faso now publicly uses Chinese armored vehicles and rocket weapons. Sahel nations that have chosen diverse, non-Western ties over Paris and Washington. When taken as a whole, they constitute a collective experiment in sovereignty, attempting to determine if Africa can secure itself independently of Western guidance. For the capitals of the West, this poses serious questions. Once the region's undisputed security guarantee, France's credibility is in ruins, despite its continued presence through drone bases and intelligence. The United States is perceived as reactive and cautious rather than dedicated. China's involvement highlights a gap in the West's ability to provide prompt, decisive assistance when African states most needed it. Beijing, on the other hand, has demonstrated that it can supply convoys of contemporary equipment in a matter of months, changing the landscape of the battlefield virtually instantly. That effectiveness has a great deal of symbolic significance. The ramifications are just as important for insurgents. The idea that state forces were unprepared and ineffective has long been a source of support for these groups. To keep one step ahead of national forces, they make use of speed, mobility, and rural hiding places. That edge could be lost with the advent of stabilized autocannons, hybrid mortars, and long-range rockets. Of course, militants can change. They will no longer be able to presume that rural sanctuaries are immune to reprisals. Therefore, they may look for new strategies, like dispersal into smaller groups or increased reliance on civilian shields. Fear may start to shift psychologically back toward the state. However, the repercussions are not just military. The turn toward China by Burkina Faso is indicative of a larger change in African agency. African countries were convinced for decades that Western kindness was essential to their security. Ouagadougou is now proving that there are other options. There will be close observation by other governments throughout the continent. The concept may spread if Burkina Faso receives assistance from China in stabilizing even a portion of its territory. Then, arms sales might serve as the basis for more extensive collaboration in governance, technology, and infrastructure, strengthening China's position in Africa. However, there are risks associated with the transition. Reliance on a new sponsor, especially one as practical as Beijing, might recreate the fundamental weaknesses these countries are attempting to overcome. Future economic shocks could give China influence over Burkina Faso's policy if its repayment plans depend on gold exports. Critics caution that concentrating on heavy weapons runs the risk of ignoring the underlying social and political causes of poverty, marginalization, insurgency, and poor governance. While sophisticated missiles can eliminate militants, they are unable to restore public confidence in the government. For Burkina Faso authorities, however, the calculation is straightforward. Today's survival is more important than tomorrow's imagined dangers. They see the Chinese collaboration as an opportunity to redefine sovereignty on African terms, diversify alliances, and challenge outdated hierarchies, not as a sign of dependency. Refusing to be left exposed while waiting for Western powers to decide their fate is more important than changing masters. Therefore, Burkina Faso is not the only issue at hand. It's a region at a turning point. China might become a key player in African security if the new Chinese arsenal aids Burkina Faso in regaining its territory and confidence. This could lead to a series of similar agreements. Failure to do so would strengthen doubts about the ability of outside parties, whether Western or Eastern, to resolve the Sahel's problems in the future. However, one fact cannot be denied. Western experiments are no longer passively conducted in the Sahel. Ouagadougou has shown that Africa is prepared to chart its own path, even if it upsets established countries by accepting Beijing's weapons. More than only firepower was being delivered by the Chinese convoys that were moving into Burkina Faso. They had a message to convey. The rules of the game are being rewritten in Africa, not in Paris or Washington, as a new era dawns. Has the largest power change in the recent history of the Sahel been precipitated by Burkina Faso? Will insurgencies eventually be defeated by Chinese weapons? Could this be the start of a new reliance on a different world power? Tell us what you think in the comments section below, and please do not forget to like and subscribe for more informative videos like this one.